Welcome to another episode of Effortless Coding. My name is Samuel and I'm glad that you've joined us in this particular episode. So today we are going to create a table that will store our user information, and this table will actually be used to retrieve information when the user will be logging in the HTML form. So let's get to it. Now, for you to create a table, you need three things. Number one is the name of the table. You must know the name of the table beforehand as you're creating the table. In this episode, we'll call our table users because it's going to store information, user information. Then you also need to know the name of the fields within the table. Remember, the table stores data, and this data has to be properly arranged. So for example, you might have the full name of the user. That should be a field on its own. You might have the email of the user, that's a field on its own within the table. You also need a password that the user will use to log in, and that is also a field within the table. So you have to know the name of the fields. And lastly, you have to know the definitions of each field. So for example, the name field, you have to know that these are text field. And in MySQL database, when we'll be doing the syntax, you will know how we define that particular field. So just know that the three things that you need before you create a table is you have to know the name of the table, the name of the fields, and the definitions of each of those fields. This is the general syntax, so you'll replace with the names accordingly. So you will, as you can see on my screen, it's create space table space table name. So in this case, you will replace the table name with the name of your table. Then in brackets, column name, right? Column name, so you'll replace the name of the field with a column name, and then column type will also be replaced by one of the definition of your field, which in this case will be the type. So that's the general syntax of how you create a table. Now let's create a table in the login database. And as I've said, our table will be called users. So go to your phpMyAdmin. Then in your phpMyAdmin, select the login database. As you can see on my screen, that login database, we had created it in the previous episode. Now, I will focus only on the command line syntax. So once you've selected the login database, click on the SQL menu. And in the box, I want you to write the following syntax. Write create. Remember, we had the general syntax. So I want you to write create space table space. Now, the name of our table in this case is users. 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 So once you've done that, I want you to open your brackets and say the first field we'll have in our table will be called user ID. A field can also be called a column. So our first column or our first field will be user ID. User will be small letters and then ID in capital, and it will be one word, user ID. That is the column name. The column type, if you can remember the general syntax, the column type in this case will be big int. Now we'll be talking about column types later on in the series, so don't worry about that. Just write big int, which means big integer. And in brackets, put the name, the figure 20. So 20 means this big int will have 20 characters. It will have up to 20 characters. You'll put a space and say not in capital, then space null, meaning this particular field will never at any point in time be null. Remember, null means containing nothing. Then space after not null, say space, then auto, AUTO, underscore increment, then comma. Now auto increment basically means this particular field will be used like our ID. So the first row will have number 1. We don't need to put number 2 on the second row. It will automatically write 2. If you enter the next detail, it will be 3. So it will actually be auto incrementing. So that's the user ID, and this particular field, we will define it as our primary key because this is what defines, it's actually the first thing that defines the table itself. So it will be a primary key when we want to reference it to other tables. We will learn about primary keys in no time, so don't worry. To separate different fields within the table, when you're creating a table that has more than one field, we've already finished putting details for the first field. So for you to enter details for the second, to define the second field, you have to put a comma after the details of the first. So after you've written auto increment, I want you to put a comma. Then now define username in small letters, space. So we'll have a field called username. And in this case, this username will store the email. Your email address will actually be used as a username when you're logging in. So the field will be called username, space, varchar, as you can see on my screen, varchar. That means a variable character, varchar. In brackets, write 100. So we are giving it a character limit of 100. So it cannot surpass 100 characters. So that username must be at most 100 characters. Then space, not null, the same way we did the previous one, meaning it must contain something. It will never contain nothing. Then comma. Now, if we are using other SQL related languages, and we wanted to define this because we want the username to be unique. You don't want somebody to register with the same email twice. You want records to be unique. So if it was other related SQL platforms, we would have added the unique command, the unique inbuilt command to say that this field will be unique. But just like the primary key, we will define it after we've defined our fields. So don't worry about that. So just put a semicolon after not null. Then we go to the next field called password in small letters, space, varchar, the same way we did for the username. Open your brackets. In the brackets, write 100. Then space, not null, meaning it must contain something. Then comma, let's go to the next field, full name, which is our last field. Full name, so full is in small letters. The word N, the letter N is in capital, so it should be full name. So full, small letters, N capital, then A-M-E in small, full name. This is just my naming convention. You can come up with your own naming convention depending on how you want. It's not that you must follow this particular convention. But I prefer if you combine two words, the first word will be small in letters, the second one will start with a capital letter. If there are three words, same thing. The first word will be small letter, second word will start with a capital, third word will start with a capital. That is my own naming convention. You can come up with your own. If you want to put like an underscore or a hyphen, it's up to you. Okay, so then space varchar after the field name, full name. Then varchar in brackets 100, then still say not null. Then comma. Remember, when somebody is registering, in a real life situation, you also need to store the date or the time they actually registered. So we'll also create a field called date created, which will not be in the form field when you're registering. It will be automatically captured just by the computer itself that you're registering. But we have to capture that time in our database. So write date created. So naming convention, first word date will be in small, created will start with a capital, one word, date created, space. The type for this particular field will be date time, DATETIME, all in capital and one word. Then put comma. Now after that, now I want us to define. Remember we said user ID will be our primary key. Now a primary key is normally used when you're trying to reference a table or rather link a table to another. Let's assume you have the users table, and then there's also another table called user type where we have normal members, we have administrators, we have super users. So you would want to link probably the user type table with the users table so that you don't have for every particular user to enter the name member, but you want to link it so that it says if user type on the other table number 1 refers to member, you'll just be using that number 1. So the primary key on the user type might be 1 for member, and on this particular one, users, for example, the name Effortless Coding might also be referenced by a user ID 1. So when you're referring the two, you want to use the two tables, you'll only use the primary keys. So I hope you've understood. This primary key will be a foreign key in this particular table. We will learn about that. It's called relationships in database. We'll learn about that later, so don't worry about that. Let's just set our primary key as the user ID. So for that, after you've created the date created field and you've given it a type, date type, comma, type primary space key in capital, and then space and in brackets write user ID, meaning you've set the user ID field. User ID should actually be in the same way you define the user ID field. If you said small, first word small and then ID in capital, same thing you should use. You cannot change. MySQL is also case sensitive, so if you do a different one, it will mean you're referring to a different field. So after you've done that, write comma. Then remember we said we want our username to be unique. We don't want people to enter 2 email addresses that are the same to refer to 2 people. We want every person must have their own unique email address. So for that we have to set the username field as unique. So type, after putting a comma, type the word unique in capital, and in brackets I want you to enter the name of the field that you want it to be unique. In this case, it will be username. So once you've done that and you've closed the brackets for the username, close the main bracket. Remember when you were saying create table users, we started with a main bracket. So close that bracket again and then put a semicolon. So once that is done, we've created our table. Once you click on the go down there, you will have created a table called users that has those fields that we've already created within this table. So I hope you've understood how to do that, and I've given you an assignment. Go use the graphical user interface to create another table of your own choosing. Choose your own fields, choose your own data types, create a table within the login database using the graphical user interface. And until next time, it's always kudos